circle of rat back and I'm going and leaving tracks in morning. And I don't give a crap whether you streaming, you torrent this. You can try to contest, but you'll be needing an army. Beat them in Normandy, current rappers eat to the warning.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to talk about ECW, the biography on A&E that taught us nothing, where we learned nothing and heard the same stories over and over again. So how am I going to make the most of this video? Well, I'd guess we're going to talk about some of the things that weren't in the documentary that probably should have been, things that were in other documentaries, things that have been talked about and discussed over time, and how this fleshes out the ECW story. First, let's talk about things that were not in the story. So there's no talk about how ECW was founded under the vision of Todd Gordon and Eddie Gilbert, who wanted to have a Memphis-based wrestling promotion outside of Memphis. So they wanted to have a rough and rowdy type of promotion. Joel Goodhart, who used to run in that area, had vacated. He stole a bunch of money and ran, left the boys penniless, and some of the other people with no cash whatsoever. And Todd Gordon essentially stepped in, using his jewelry store as a way to finance their promotion. And they forgot, they just scribbled through all of that. None of that matters. None of that happened. So we go straight from Paul Heyman, who he was, what he did, and then, ECW. From there, we stopped when ECW went out of business. So no talk at all about ECW 2006, was it 2005, 2006, the one night stand shows, which I think are absolutely worth discussing when you talk about the history of ECW, especially 20 years out. We could talk about one night stand. When the original WWE documentaries came out, which was very good, by the way, one night stand had not happened yet. But since then, there have been several ECW documentaries, some unofficial outside of WWE documentaries, Forever Hardcore, Barbed Wire, all that kind of stuff has come out. So there's been plenty of information on ECW. So that's why I don't understand why they're doing ECW in terms of a biography. I don't understand it, especially if you're not going to give us anything like backstage stuff or anything like that to show us how this documentary is going to be different from the previous ones. But let's talk about something that was not mentioned that probably should have been. Paul Heyman has, over the course of the years, discussed different ways ECW could have survived. In the documentary, he only mentions that he wanted to have the pay-per-view money that he felt like he was owed, but he wasn't going to get them without putting those pay-per-views on, and he couldn't afford it. So for those of you who don't know, ECW was $8 million in debt, almost $9 million in debt when the company went out of business. Paul Heyman only had $1.4 million, and he could not pay his creditors, and he could not pay his talent. He was essentially dead broke. So he didn't have any money to host the next pay-per-view to get paid for that pay-per-view to keep the company running. But most importantly, they had lost their television deal with TNN, as Viacom had decided to go with WWE as essentially a replacement. Now, this is worth discussing, that ECW as a product was not advertiser friendly. This is something that wrestling fans just have to toggle with. The stuff that you think is fun, the stuff that you like, is advertising repulsion. People do not like that stuff. Advertisers do not want to advertise on realistic wrestling shows. Again, realistic. It's not real, but it's realistic. It's real enough. A real person is hitting another real person with a steel chair, and they don't want to pay to advertise on those products. So when you have something like ECW, or something like early stage TNA, or Attitude Era WWF, it becomes very difficult to get advertiser revenue for your television partners. So because the advertising revenue was not coming in, TNN stopped promoting ECW. Joey Styles and Paul Heyman and all these guys complained endlessly about TNN never promoting ECW. But what is there to promote? You're going to spend more money on a product you're not going to make any money on? That doesn't make any sense. This is how cable networks are funded. They're funded through ad dollars. So if you're killing the ad revenue because you keep hitting guys in the head with chairs, you're bleeding all over the place, there's all kind of sex and violence and music that they don't want you to play because they have to pay for that, then yeah, there's going to be a problem. So back to my original point. There was an interview with WWE.com where Paul Heyman made the claim that Vince McMahon tried to get ECW on USA. This was something that I feel like should have been fleshed out in the documentary if it was true. Now, Paul has said a lot of things throughout history that has not been true. This is questionable. Now, according to Paul, Vince McMahon, upon leaving USA Network, put in a good word for ECW, which led to some conversations between Stephen Chow, Barry Diller, and Paul Heyman. Heyman claims that these would go for hours, for an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, the conversations. Now, Barry Diller is the individual who purchased USA Network in the mid-90s and started kind of going into cost-cutting mode. And as he was going into cost-cutting mode, if you believe the Mooneyham book, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, he was looking to get rid of pro wrestling in the first place back in 1998. This would have been right in the middle of the Attitude Era, right in the middle of WWE doing all that they possibly could do to get revenue or viewers to compete with WCW. Well, in doing so, they started doing a lot of gratuitous things. They got busted for Jacqueline's boot being out on television and all this kind of stuff, right? So, according to Paul, Vince put in a good word and was looking to have ECW picked up by USA Network. Well, other than Barry Diller wanting to cut costs, he also did not really want wrestling on the network. If you believe the Mooneyham book, he was looking to get rid of pro wrestling back in 98. That's the first thing. The second thing is that WWE and USA Network was in the middle of a lawsuit in 99, 2000 as they were leaving. Because USA Network, which had actually backed up WWE during a lot of their trials and tribulations of the Attitude Era, they felt like WWE had busted some of the contractual obligations they had in negotiating with Viacom, and this led to a really gruesome lawsuit between the three parties, where USA Network, Viacom, and WWF was in the middle of a lawsuit. Well, obviously, WWF ended up going to Viacom, TNN, so that they ended up winning, but there was some difficulties between WWF and USA Network at the time. So how could Vince use any influence after these people just sued him for trying to leave the network, after Barry Diller and Bonnie Hammer had to have a bit of a confrontation in order to keep the show on the air 2 years prior? It seems to be just a little less credible that when Paul says, oh, we were going to be on USA Network, they were going to save us. Not likely. They also canceled boxing in 1998, which is the same year Barry Diller, well, maybe a year or two before Barry Diller took over. So he was literally in there cutting out things that he felt did not turn revenue properly. He was a Hollywood guy, right? Okay, so it's not likely that the USA Network thing is true from my perspective. There might be somebody out there who knows a little bit more about this thing than me. But let's talk about the second one. Paul Heyman talked about Universal Music Group was going to come into ECW and buy a minority ownership in the company. Well, we don't know how true that is, clearly, and there's virtually no way of looking at it, but he did have certain people that he was able to meet because their sons were fans or whatever. One of these people was Jimmy Iovine. Jimmy Iovine, the boss of Interscope Records, the guy over Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg for a while, and 50 Cent and Eminem. His son, Jamie, mentioned in an interview a couple of years ago that his dad was actually in conversation to purchase ECW, which is very, very interesting. That Jimmy Iovine was a fan of ECW, and Tony Khan's dad was a fan of ECW. Tony Khan and his dad went to ECW shows, and Jimmy Iovine, who was the boss of Interscope, was into ECW. Neither one of them ended up, of course, buying it, but it lends a little bit of credence to the idea that Universal was going to buy ECW, or at least buy a share of it. And of course, this is also something they could have discussed, that Billy Corgan, who now owns the NWA, He was also going to be a minority owner of ECW. He and Paul Heyman had conversations about it. He offered Paul $1 million, and he asked for $1 million. What do I get? And Paul said, you get 10% of the company. And Billy Corgan said, ECW is not worth $10 million, which is absolutely true. They were $8 million in debt. Paul Heyman himself only had $1.4 million. So if Corgan would have put up $1 million, he should have at least been part owner. I'm talking like 40% owner if he was going to be in, and they still would have been $6 million in debt. So Paul Heyman, apparently there were some people, and this doesn't come from that article. Other people have claimed meaning Dave Meltzer has claimed, that there were some smaller regional television slots that were available to ECW, but Paul wanted to be national, and so he didn't take those. And those small networks, they might not have been enough to keep the lights on anyway. But apparently, once Paul could not get corporate backing from Jimmy Iovine, Universal, or Billy Corgan, he just threw in the towel and gave up. And it's an interesting thing that there were so many people interested in ECW that are willing to vocally say that they were interested. So Paul does run a line of bullshit sometimes. But with Jimmy Iovine's son saying, well, yeah, I met Paul when I was 15 or 16, and I know that him and my dad talked about, investing in ECW or outright purchasing the company. Again, ECW was $8 million in debt. These people had the money to pretty much, if not clear the debt, at least cut it down substantially. Not to mention, Paul was getting floated loans from Vince McMahon, who was keeping the company alive when they were losing money in the late 90s. So Paul had tons of connections. So to have as many connections as he had and still manage to go out of business, well, he worked pretty hard at that. But those are the kinds of stories that we probably should be discussing when we talk about ECW, because that's fresh, new ground. Those are new things. Yes, we know how they revolutionized the Attitude Era and they revolutionized the wrestling business and blah, blah, blah. We know all of that. What we don't know is the intricacies of how many celebrity folk was involved with ECW. How many phone calls did Paul have to make to get into conversation with people like Barry Diller, if that conversation even happened, because he's a Hollywood mogul. And you say, oh, well, Vince helped me. Maybe. But we know Jimmy Iovine was there and had a conversation, so maybe Universal was involved. But did Universal really want to get involved with pro wrestling? Well, they got sued for price fixing that year, CD price fixing, the big music industry. All these guys got busted fixing the prices of CDs. It was a disaster in 2000, 2001, thereabouts. So I don't know if they wanted to get involved with pro wrestling. We know that Acclaim Entertainment was one of the creditors because ECW went into debt to make the video game. So Acclaim owned a piece of the company. But they would go out of business a couple of years later. Acclaim, of course, is the same ones who used to make the old WWF games. So there was a lot of people involved with ECW, and it would have been so much fun to talk about that kind of stuff. But we almost never get there because we become enamored with all the interesting characters like Sandman and Sabu, and they were setting people on fire and going through tables. It's like, yeah, we talk about that endlessly. Let's talk about some of this other stuff. And we never actually get there. But the documentary was probably one of the worst because it doesn't cover any new ground. And when you not covering any new ground, there's no new information being presented. Why make it? I guess it's made for normies who don't know that there's an ECW documentary, a much better one on the network already. That there aren't better ECW documentaries floating around on YouTube right now. So, but let me know what you guys think. What you guys think of the documentary. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.